I wasn't supposed to find this. The county archives were never meant for the curious, at least not for the kind of curiosity I carried. The room smelled of damp paper and mildew, the kind of odor that clings to your lungs. I had come for something else entirely, land records for a restoration project, but what I uncovered was not catalogued. It was lodged behind a cabinet that had swollen from decades of humidity, its wood warped, its drawers sealed with a crust of rust. I tugged until the cabinet shifted just enough to expose a gap, and there it was, a ledger, bound in leather so dark it looked like dried blood. The cover had no title, only initials scorched into the hide PC. When I opened it, flakes of dust scattered across my lap, and for a moment I thought the thing might disintegrate in my hands. The ink had bled from water damage, but the words were still legible, their script slanted and impatient. The ledger wasn't a diary, not exactly. It was closer to an account book, but the entries weren't numbers. They were names. Dozens of them. Each line began with a date, 1829, 1828, 1827. Beneath, a name. Beneath that, a crude notation. Some entries were scratched with symbols I didn't recognize, almost like tally marks, others with words like delivered or refused. And then, sometimes, the letters XX drawn over the names so hard the paper tore. I felt a pressure in the room, as though the air itself had grown heavier, closing in around me. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead seemed to falter. I kept turning pages, compelled and nauseous at once, until one name reappeared again and again, Patty Cannon. The name vibrated in my head, as if it didn't belong in ink but in whispers, passed from one trembling mouth to another. The entries beside her name grew darker, more erratic, as though whoever kept this ledger was either terrified of her or obsessed. On page 47, I noticed something odd, a string of numbers gouged into the margin so deeply they cut through the paper. 117, no explanation, no context, only that number, repeated across several pages. Sometimes written with ink, sometimes carved like a wound. I closed the book to steady myself, but when I did, a small envelope slid out from between the last pages. Its paper had fused shut with age, but the corner was already torn, so I eased it open. Inside was a single sheet, blotted with black, almost entirely censored. Only a fragment remained untouched. They must never speak of the hollow doctrine. The words sat there like a living thing. Doctrine. Hollow. They didn't belong together, but their pairing gnawed at my thoughts. My heart began to race with a strange recognition, though I had never heard of it before. The silence of the archive pressed in, thick and unbroken, until I realized I was holding my breath. I slid the ledger back into my bag, hands trembling, as if I were stealing something alive. My chest burned with the certainty that someone, or something, didn't want this book disturbed. I should have walked away. I should have returned it to the dust and the rot and pretended I had never pried it loose. But the name, the number, and that blacked-out phrase wouldn't leave me. Patty Cannon. 117, the hollow doctrine. I had no choice but to dig deeper, because if I didn't, I feared those words would start digging into me. The deeper I dug, the more the ledger became less a relic and more a confession. Names, numbers, and one phrase repeated like a curse. But it wasn't until I cross-referenced 117 with county records that the true scale began to surface. The number didn't belong to an address, it was a designation. District 117, an educational zone that no longer existed, absorbed into larger county lines in the mid-19th century. At its center stood a school that, on paper, was unremarkable, the Cannon Charity School for Colored Youths, established 1822. It sounded benevolent, even progressive for its time. The founding charter described it as a sanctuary of learning, wherein the disadvantaged may receive the graces of literacy, civility, and God's Word. The Board of Trustees was a mixture of county officials and church leaders, their names familiar from courthouse plaques and faded portraits in municipal halls. But the ledger painted another picture. In the archives of the Delaware Gazette, I found a brittle announcement dated June 1823. It praised the school's founder, a man named Reverend Elias Thornwell, a preacher trained in Maryland who brought refinement and sanctity to the neglected children of our land. He wrote sermons about moral uplift, about the need to civilize the darker races, about planting seeds of virtue in barren soil. To the public, he was tireless, righteous, a man who gave up wealth to shepherd the unwanted. Yet Thornwell's name appeared in the ledger again and again, written beside Paddy Cannon's. The entries grew stranger: transfer complete. Children delivered. Refused, marked for hollow. The word hollow surfaced more than once, capitalized, as if it were a proper noun. The Gazette praised the Cannon Charity School's strict order and its success in keeping vagrancy off the streets. But the record stopped abruptly in 1829. No graduating class lists. No subsequent announcements. No trace of its alumni. And yet, in the county death records, I found something more chilling: 47 children listed as unclaimed burial by parish, between 1823 and 1829, all within District 117. The causes of death were vague, written as fever, consumption, or sometimes simply wasting. No family names attached. No guardians listed. Just children absorbed and erased. A letter tucked into a stack of parish correspondence hinted at more. Reverend Thornwell insists the children remain on site. He believes removal before their sanctification is blasphemous, and that none should leave until the doctrine is fulfilled. The doctrine again. Always that word, shifting from the ledger to the parish records, threaded through every mention of the school. But no sermon of Thornwell's that I could find in public collections ever referenced it. It was scrubbed, erased. I interviewed a local historian, an elderly man who had spent years cataloging forgotten churches. When I mentioned Thornwell, he lowered his voice. That wasn't a school. It was a holding pen. They sent children there, and they never came out. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. The official narrative was a mask, a benevolent Christian project sheltering neglected youth. But beneath it was machinery, systemic and relentless, that swallowed the vulnerable whole. And standing at its pulpit, sanctified in newsprint and parish ledgers, was Elias Thornwell, the smiling face of something I was beginning to suspect was never meant to be seen. I closed my notebook with hands damp from sweat. The weight of those unmarked graves pressed into me. The school was gone, the buildings razed, but the ledger, the death records, and the whispers remained. I thought I was chasing a paper trail: records, ledgers, parish files. But what I found was the absence of them. The erasure itself became the story. District 117th School had once maintained detailed registers, enrollment lists, daily logs, baptismal certificates. At least, that's what the county index suggested. But when I ordered the files, the clerk wheeled out a cart stacked with folders so thin they looked hollow. Inside, the pages repeated themselves, identical copies of the same entry, written in the same slanted hand, describing: child received, blessed, retained. No names. No variation. Just the same line, cloned across dozens of pages. It was as if the individuality of each student had been scrubbed out, overwritten by a script designed to replace memory itself. Digging further, I found a box of letters attributed to parents. They should have been desperate, pleading for their children. Instead, every letter was the same. Line for line. A formal thank you, praising Reverend Thornwell's mercy, promising prayers. The signatures were inconsistent, some too careful, some crude scratches, but the body of the letters never changed. It was impossible to tell who, if anyone, had written them. And yet, scattered between the copies, there were fragments. A few slips of paper that didn't fit the pattern. One note read only: he keeps calling me Mary, but my name isn't Mary. Another, torn at the edge: the walls whisper birthdays, but none are mine. I stared at these scraps until my vision blurred. Someone had tried to assert themselves, even as their name, maybe their entire identity, was slipping away. In a brittle oral history transcript, I found the account of a woman listed only as L.C. She had been a laundress at the Cannon School. Her testimony, recorded decades later, was broken, but her words cut through. They came with names. Bright names. Some from Bibles, some from their mothers' mouths. But Reverend Thornwell wouldn't speak them. He gave them new names, soft ones, empty ones. And the longer they stayed, the less they remembered. One day, a boy cried because he couldn't recall the sound of his own. That's when I knew they'd been taken. The ledger had suggested death. But this was worse. This was erasure, the hollowing of the self until only the doctrine remained. The most disturbing artifact came from the ruins themselves. On a crumbling stone lintel salvaged from the old school, there were carvings. Children's hands had etched their names into the surface. Or tried to. Every name had been scratched over, gouged out until the stone looked wounded. Some were obliterated entirely. Others bore faint traces, Isa, Gem, Eli. Ghosts of identities struggling to survive obliteration. The parish museum had one surviving class portrait, supposedly 1826. At first it looked ordinary, rows of children, stiff in their Sunday clothes. But the longer I looked, the more I noticed the sameness. Their eyes dulled, their faces blurred together, as though someone had retouched the photograph to erase distinctions. In the back row, one girl's head was slightly tilted, her lips parted as if she had wanted to speak. Beneath her image, the caption read simply, Mary. Every girl in that portrait, I later learned, was labeled Mary. The weight of it crushed me. These weren't just lost children, they were unmade children. Their names severed, their histories rewritten, their birthdays stolen until all that was left was a doctrine no one dared name aloud. I realized then that memory itself had been their prison. And now, sifting through these fractured traces, I could feel the same gravity working on me. My own name pulsed in my head, urgent, as if reminding me not to let it slip. I had been warned that nothing remained of the Cannon School but a foundation, overgrown and half sunk into the Delaware marshland. Still, I went. The ruins looked ordinary enough, a rectangular outline of stone, the hint of a collapsed cellar. Grass and nettles grew where classrooms once stood. But the earth was wrong. The ground dipped unnaturally, as if something beneath it had been swallowed and buried. A single entrance remained, an arched stairwell descending into shadow, bricked up but cracked by roots and time. I pried it open with a crowbar, the stale air rushing out like breath from a tomb. The stairs should have ended after a dozen steps. Instead, they kept going. Stone gave way to wood, then back to stone, as if the structure had been rebuilt again and again. The deeper I descended, the more the geometry shifted. Steps slanted, walls bowed inward. At one point, I circled down 3 flights only to emerge where I had begun. My flashlight flickered as if straining against something that did not want to be seen. In the cellar chambers, the architecture fractured further. Narrow corridors branched off into sealed rooms with doors that didn't match their frames. One door led nowhere, bolted shut against blank brick. Another opened into a closet no larger than a coffin, its walls scratched with deep grooves. On the floor were bottles, their glass cloudy with residue, opiate tinctures, laudanum, chloroform. I found journals locked in a tin chest. The handwriting matched Thornwell's sermons, though these pages were never meant for parish eyes. He described therapies, silence imposed for weeks, eyes blindfolded, mouth sewn to prevent profane utterances. He wrote of sensory deprivation as holy purification, children kept in complete darkness, listening for God until their minds became vessels for the doctrine. There were sketches too. Children sitting in circles, heads bowed, each with a candle before them. But the drawings showed no flames, only black smoke rising upward, pooling against the ceiling. In another chamber, I found rows of shallow basins carved into the floor, each stained dark. Some still held the broken remains of leather straps, rusted buckles. Above them hung hooks, their shadows like skeletal fingers. The air carried a metallic tang. That's when the first unreal thing happened. My flashlight caught a wall that seemed damp, the stone streaked as though water had seeped through. But when I touched it, the wetness was tacky, red-black, metallic on my skin. My chest tightened. The wall was bleeding. Slowly, steadily, as if the stones themselves were remembering. I staggered back, and in the beam of my light I saw movement. A mirror leaned against the far wall, cracked down its center. My reflection should have been warped, fractured. But it wasn't. It was whole, too whole. My double stood in the mirror, lips moving as if speaking, though I made no sound. Then, faintly, through the silence, I heard it, a whisper. Not my name. Not any name. Just one word. Hollow. The candle drawings came back to me then. I shone the light around, and in a corner, I saw stubs of real candles, long extinguished. My hand brushed one as I passed, and for a breathless instant it flared alive, no match, no spark, just sudden flame, steady and accusing. I fled the chamber, climbing until my lungs burned. But when I finally emerged into daylight, the stairwell's length seemed impossible. I should have ascended for minutes. Instead, my watch said nearly 2 hours had passed. I wanted to believe the Cannon School was a singular aberration, one building, one preacher, one ledger of atrocities. But the deeper I followed the threads, the less isolated it became. The break came when I returned to the ledger's carved number, 117. I had assumed it was a district designation. But inside the school's cellar, among the rusted buckles and bleeding walls, I found a registry book half melted by damp. The pages that survived listed transfers not just into District 117, but out. The columns marked destinations with numbers, 114, 119, 123. At least 9 different locations, each with their own holding. Maps in the county archive corroborated it, educational districts that no longer existed, each erased and absorbed into larger counties after suspiciously brief lifespans. Each had once hosted a charity school, a sanctuary, or a missionary orphanage. Always the same phrasing, always the same pattern, open in the 1820s or 1830s, shutter within a decade, leave no graduates, no survivors. On microfilm reels of the Baltimore Herald, I found a 1831 article praising the St. Jude Academy for Lost Children, in District 114. The portrait of its founder chilled me, his face different, his name different, but in his hand he held the same black-bound Bible with initials scorched into the cover, P.C. It was not Patty Cannon's name. It was a symbol. Flipping through records from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and even into Virginia, I saw the same repeating iconography. The phrase, doctrine fulfilled, scrawled in margin notes. The identical ritual sketches, children in circles, smoke rising. Transfers of students shuffled across state lines, listed as gifts or deliveries. The most damning was a ledger fragment held at the Maryland Historical Society. It catalogued deliveries from 1825 to 1837, each entry signed not by an individual, but by a collective, the Order of the Fifth Veil. The handwriting was elegant, almost ceremonial, and the names of the schools matched what I had already traced. The order seemed to oversee the entire network, a lattice of institutions bound by silence, all feeding the same doctrine. What unsettled me most was the final page of that ledger. Someone had sketched a crude family tree, branches branching outward. At first I thought it was symbolic, lineages of children erased. But then I recognized a name at the bottom corner. My own surname. It shouldn't have been there. My family had never lived in Delaware in the 1800s. And yet there it was, written plainly, as if marking the continuation of some forgotten chain. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but as I pulled census records, the connections deepened. A woman listed as my great-great-grandmother's sister, unknown to our family tree, appeared briefly in an 1850 census in Maryland, listed as Ward of Mission. She disappeared from subsequent records, her age never advancing, as if she had been swallowed whole. The doctrine wasn't dead. It had only hidden, nesting itself into bloodlines, preserving its silence in the gaps and erasures of family histories. The more I chased, the closer it crept. And then there were the letters. Anonymous, slipped into my mailbox with no return address. They bore the same seal as Thornwell's journals, an eye behind a veil. Inside were only a few words, written in steady hand, the order remembers. We do not forget our Marys. The phrase seared through me. This wasn't just history. It was legacy, still operating, still watching. And for reasons I could not yet comprehend, I was tangled in its roots. The order did not come for me in shadowed robes or midnight rituals. It came in the form of a letter slid beneath my door, plain white envelope, no seal this time. Inside was a page torn from a child's workbook, smeared with age. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Do not let them leave. Do not let them speak their names. The doctrine remains. That night, I returned to the ruins. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't resist the pull. The stairwell waited like an open throat. My flashlight faltered with each step until it guttered out completely, leaving me in candlelight I hadn't lit. At the bottom, I found the chamber again, the basins, the hooks, the bleeding walls. But this time, someone was there. A girl, no older than 12, dressed in the simple linen of another century. Her skin was gray with dust, but her eyes were alive, too alive. She knelt beside one of the basins, hands folded. I waited, she whispered. Her voice was raw, cracked, as though unused for decades. They said if I was still, if I was quiet, I'd be finished. But I'm not finished. She looked at me then, the weight of every erased child pressing through her gaze. Will it matter if I get out? Her question struck deeper than any ledger or sermon. What did freedom mean for someone with no name, no record, no place in history? To remember her was to wound her again. To forget her was to let the doctrine win. Behind her, against the wall, sat a box of records I had never seen before, ledgers, journals, transfer lists. Proof. All of it. Names unblotted, unburned. Pages that could expose the order for what it was, lay bare every stolen child, every hollowing. But beside the box was another object, a key, heavy and black, its teeth jagged as if designed to lock more than doors. I realized then that the choice was mine. If I took the records, I could expose everything. But I knew what it would mean, family trees shattered, descendants learning their names had been taken, not given. Every survivor, every buried secret would be ripped into daylight. And the order would not vanish. They would retaliate. If I locked them away again, sealed it all, I could protect the fragile lives that had managed to survive in silence. The order would remain in shadow, but at least those who escaped it would not be dragged back. The girl waited, her eyes burning through me. Please, she said, her lips trembling. Don't let me be just another Mary. I sank to my knees. The chamber pressed in, damp and metallic, the candlelight shaking against the bleeding stones. My hands hovered between the box and the key, the truth and the silence. In the end, I chose not with my head but with my hands. I struck a match and held it to the first page of the ledger. The ink curled, the parchment blackened. Flames spread quickly, hungry, consuming names that had waited nearly 2 centuries to be spoken. The girl gasped, not in pain, but in release. She reached toward the rising smoke, her form unraveling into ash and light. For an instant, I thought I heard dozens of voices whispering in unison, not hollow this time, but a single word, remember. When the fire was done, I set the black key upon the smoldering ash. One candle remained lit, burning steady though no air should have fed it. I left it there, a vigil for what had been erased. And when I stepped into daylight, the ruins seemed emptier than ever, emptier, and yet heavier, as though they knew the doctrine had not ended. Only hidden. Only waiting. The fire was explained away easily enough. The county paper called it an accident of unstable masonry, citing a collapse of the Cannon School's ruined foundation. The official report, stamped and signed, noted electrical failure due to unauthorized wiring by trespassers. None of it made sense. The building had no wiring, no power lines, but the explanation was repeated until it stuck. By the week's end, the ruins were fenced off, marked for demolition. What the public would never know was how precise the fire had been. The chamber beneath had been consumed, every ledger reduced to ash, every hook and basin warped beyond recognition. No one asked about the smell of charred paper that lingered for days. No one wondered why the fire spread only underground, leaving the marsh grass above untouched. The coroner's office logged the discovery of animal bones scattered in the soil. They were bagged, mislabeled, and shelved in a municipal warehouse already buckling under decades of neglect. No mention of the small jawbones, the tiny ribs, the wrist bones barely the width of a finger. To name them would be to acknowledge them, and acknowledgement was the very thing the doctrine had always feared. At the demolition site, one artifact was recovered by the crew, a locket, blackened but intact, fused shut by heat. Inside, when pried open, was no photograph, no hair clipping, no saint's icon. Only a scrap of parchment with one word written in faded ink, Mary. The workers laughed at the superstition of it, pocketed it for luck, and thought no more of it. The locket would disappear again, sold at a flea market or passed between hands until its origin was forgotten, its weight no less potent. I told myself I had chosen release, that burning the records had freed the children from endless repetition. But the more I replayed that chamber in my mind, the less certain I became. Had I destroyed their only proof, ensuring they would be forgotten again? Or had I spared the living from a legacy too heavy to carry? The smoke still clung to my lungs, and with it, the whisper of their final word. The Order of the Fifth Veil did not appear again, not directly. But I noticed small things. Library catalogs updated overnight, with older files disappearing into restricted collections. Genealogy databases redacted entire branches of family trees, citing data errors. In every case, the gaps aligned with the schools I had traced. It was as though the order no longer needed bribes or threats. The machinery of forgetting now ran by itself. I keep telling myself I will stop. That the doctrine is buried, smoldering beneath the rubble. But some nights, when the air is still, I catch the faint scent of smoke on my clothes, though I haven't lit a fire in weeks. And in the silence before sleep, I hear children whispering, not names, not pleas. Just one sound, over and over, spoken from lips that had been denied their own words, remember. I wasn't supposed to find this. I wasn't supposed to open the ledger, follow the numbers, descend into the marrow of its design. But I did. And now I know what the order has always known, too.